Our story begins in 1911. The world of sport is preparing for the Stockholm Olympics. All around the globe, athletes eagerly awaited this ultimate showdown, not only to represent themselves, but also their nation and its honor. Most could not await its opening day. However, this didn't apply to everyone. You see, the Austrian football delegation was facing a tiny issue. The organization of their national team was a complete mess. At this time, Austria's team was selected by a committee of representatives from Vienna's top clubs, whose main characteristics were terrible decision-making. The participants were only concerned with the good of their own players and clubs, which resulted in a bad national team that brought home bad results. Change was necessary. In such a tricky environment, one man would distinguish himself with diplomatic maneuvers that eventually made him into the head of Olympia preparations. This man's name was Hugo Meisel, and he is majorly responsible for the existence of every big football tournament that you know of, and you have never heard of him. So, let us fill this gap in our knowledge by asking, who was Hugo Meisel? When little Hugo first saw the light of the world, his life trajectory had already been decided. Being the firstborn son of a Jewish businessman, from day one it was clear that Hugo was the heir to his father's trade. All decisions concerning him were made with this one goal in mind. Convinced that the way to achieve results was for his successor to enjoy the best possible education, his father naturally sent him to the imperial capital of Wien, alone, when he was 12 years old. I think it is fair to say that most, if not all of us, at such a tender age and put under huge pressure, would have simply done as we were told. But not Hugo. Now left to his own devices and equipped only with a rebellious mind, Hugo was free to do whatever he wanted. And as if destiny itself had intervened, just down the road from where he was staying, on a small field of grass called the Jesuitenwiese, was the pitch of Vienna Cricket and Football Club. Then Hugo fell in love for the rest of his life. Brought to the city by English immigrants, football spread quickly and attracted many young people especially. Why Hugo fell in love with this sport in particular, we can only speculate about. Whatever the case, Hugo's newfound obsession brought with it the ire of his father. Pleading with his successor, first via mail, then in personal talks, afterwards moving the family to Vienna and eventually sending him far away from the city and its football scene, forcing an end to any ambition he might have had as a player in the process, it was all futile. Little Hugo had grown up and had stayed true to himself. He had made his decision to become a part of the footballing world, and if he couldn't be a player, he'd just have to carve himself another path. His first steps he thus made as a referee. When Hugo started in this role, the interest in football had expanded quite drastically. Whilst there were only 7 Viennese football clubs in 1897, there were already 45 in 1900. Mostly clubs of students and the upper classes, the latter of which had tried to keep away the larger working population, which was a partially successful effort. Still, the sport was ever expanding, and with such a large group of newly interested people comes confusion. Few were sure of what the game's rules were, including referees. In this environment, Meisel distinguished himself as a strict but fair leader of the game's affairs, and his talent was recognized. Only 3 years of experience were enough for his appointment as the specialist for questions of refereeing in the Austrian Football Association. From the spotlight, he also jumped into FIFA affairs at only 26 years of age, becoming an Austrian delegate. He would stay in this position, uninterrupted, for 30 years. At this point, Meisel had thoroughly cemented his place within Austrian football and was considered to be one of the country's leading experts. From this position, he jump-started into the Austrian national team, and his biggest challenge yet. What Meisel found was not great. Besides the terrible selection process, the team itself was just not good. Under his watch, neither performances nor results improved significantly. Asking for advice, Meisel was told that what the team really needed was a good coach, and he was recommended the 28-year-old James Jammy Hogan. From the beginning, these two had amazing chemistry. Hogan, unlike Meisel, had a distinct style of play. He referred to it as the Scottish game. What does the Scottish game mean? It means passing, passing, and passing. Hogan wanted to play a style that was based on technical ability, intelligence, and teamwork. Meisel agreed with his friend's approach and supported him wherever he could. In the following years, he would get Hogan involved with several different clubs from Vienna, where the same style of play was implemented. Still, results wouldn't come immediately. Austria played a bad Olympics, and their time together was cut short by the outbreak of World War I. Whilst Meisel went to fight in Serbia and Italy, Hogan was exiled to Budapest because he was an Englishman. Simply speaking, the point in time where this football was viable had not yet come. Regardless, this relationship that was built all the way back in 1911 was the basis for something that simply needed a jumping board. This jumping board was the 20s football boom. After Austria had lost the Weltkrieg, the country was in crisis. Unemployment, bitterness, lost pride, paramilitary groups. Daily life was not pretty. Everybody needed a distraction. Football was that distraction. The sport exploded onto the scene, reaching attendances from 20 and 30 to 60, 80, and even 100,000 people per match. In a city of 1.9 million inhabitants, up to 300,000 went to football matches in a day. Almost 15% of the population absorbed by one sport. Viewers were mostly from the working class districts, which were hit hardest. For them, football was not only a venting tool, but the center of social life. And after 90 minutes were played, just as the Brits had their local pubs, the Viennese found themselves in their coffee houses. These became centers of football discussion, football journalism, football coaching, and all other facets of football life. Hugo Meisel too was a frequent guest at the Ringcafé, and considering his obsession, you can imagine that this was basically his living room. For many, the sport was their primary escape from a day-to-day life of poverty. But for others, it presented an opportunity. Many children in the pre-war era had picked up the sport as a favorite pastime, but now that it was this popular, their hobby could be made into a career. This was particularly true for Vienna's Czech-speaking minority. They were already poor before the economy collapsed, and so there was nothing to do except play football. Czech influence was immense in the 20s and 30s. Josef Uridil, Matthias Schindler, or Josef Pikan are just a few names in a sea of second-generation immigrants. Often enough, they even practiced the same play style, one that just so happened to be based on passing. This next generation of players, combined with Hogan's work and many other factors, including even the cultural identity of Vienna itself, would lead to the Scottish game becoming synonymous with the city itself. So much so that the style was now popularly referred to as Die Wiener Schule, the Viennese school. With this new generation on the rise, Austria's way to the top became a possibility. Even now, they needed a facilitator, somebody who could create an environment where the sport could prosper. And this is exactly where Hugo Meisel was at his finest. After his return from the front lines, Meisel was no longer Austria's national coach. In his absence, he was replaced by Heinrich Rechery, who was terrible, so immediately got his job back. As the Verbandskapitän, Meisel was responsible for everything concerning the national team, from selection to accommodation, management, translation, and so on. But that wasn't the end of it. Really, in the 20s, Hugo Meisel was the most important person in Austrian football, and one of the most important in international football as a whole. His biggest successes in this period were not found on the pitch, but rather in the development of the sport as a whole. And boy oh boy, was he about to develop. First up was promoting Austria's club football. Meisel's idea was to professionalize the sport, as the English had done long ago. Believe it or not, football back then was absolutely corrupt and hypocritical. I know, unimaginable today. Although everyone loved to claim that they were practicing a holy and pure amateur's game, as revenues were increasing, so did everyone's desire to make a bit of money. Clubs started paying their players behind closed doors, hoping that the tax collector wouldn't find out about it. Whilst Vienna's big clubs wanted to professionalize, the amateurs clubs and their associates were against this. This is where Meisel came in. After he proceeded to lead a fight with FIFA, the ÖFB, the Social Democratic Party of Austria, and many a journalist, he was allowed to work out the first concept for a professional league on the continent, pretty much by himself, in 4 months, and the madman pulled it off. In September 1924, the first season of professional football on the continent started, and soon many countries would follow suit. Purely on a sporting level, professionalism was an immense success, Viennese teams became some of the best on the continent and their players some of the best in the world that Meisel could now select from. Financially, this was another story. The clubs were now companies and thus no longer tax exempt. They had to give up almost 50% of their earnings, not their profit, their earnings. This was a major factor in the bankruptcy of multiple established clubs. Many of Europe's professional clubs had financial issues around this time. Thinking about a collective solution, they wanted to start a new competition that would attract the masses and bring in much-needed revenue. The Mitropa was born. The Czechoslovaks, Hungarians, Austrians, and from 1929 onwards the Italians built the core of this project. Meisel was the head manager and once again the organizational focal point. Viennese teams were astoundingly successful in this tournament. Austria's footballers were not only professionals now, they could go head-to-head with the best that the continent had to offer. But Meisel was not done. Oh no, these two projects were simply pragmatic solutions to problems that had arisen organically. Hugo Meisel's big dream was the European Cup, the ultimate competition to foster cooperation and peace between Europe's many peoples. It didn't happen. Instead, he got a milquetoast version, where the Central European nations competed against one another in a league-based system of loosely connected national games. At least it was popular with the people, and the winner got a good-looking trophy. Other than that, he was involved in the organization of the World Cup. Whilst not entirely convinced of its viability, he still gave it the needed attention. During the 20s, Meisel had an unbelievable track record. What we've said so far doesn't even include his work for the national team and Austria's clubs, but for them too he was constantly organizing, engaging in talks, traveling, searching for accommodation, working out tactics, taking care of young people, passing style, going to clubs to talk about clubs financially, utilizing negotiating abroad, talking business. Looking at under such circumstances, it is no wonder that, eventually, disaster struck. In 1929, Meisel was hit hard. His obsessive, restless work schedule got the better of him. He caught a very serious illness that left him out cold for about a year. At certain points, it looked like he wouldn't be making any recovery at all. A different disaster, and one that would completely shape Meisel's fate, was the New York bank run of 1929. The entire world, and thus also Little Austria, had to live with an unseen amount of economic collapse, and thus with the beginning of a very dark period. Whilst the country was able to make a bit of a recovery during the not-so-golden 20s, the economic crisis left an already vulnerable society out to die. The only ones who would really profit from this affair were part of a small movement, but that is all future territory. For now, it was 1929. All Meisel could think about in the midst of this disaster was returning to football. What he probably didn't anticipate was that his most famed success was just around the corner. Meisel returned to his job in early 1930. For the first time in a decade, Austria's 11 had not been selected by him. Between 1919 and 29, it was constant chopping and changing in search of the best 11, specifically after the creation of the World Cup had been announced. Although none of Europe's big nations competed in Uruguay in 1930, for Meisel that just meant another 4 years of preparation. But in typical fashion, his involvement went way beyond selection and into the realms of active coaching. Meisel had very strong opinions on what was required of a good coach. To quote the man himself, "A coach must know as much about sports massages as a professional masseur. He must know about anatomy, must endure criticism from the press, and be careful with every statement. A coach who wants to do his task justice must be a moral role model and constantly learn and learn." Those characteristics built the foundation for good coaching. Although Meisel preferred leaving the individual training units to others, he was also an expert when it came to modern training methods. He deeply believed that the only way to get the best out of his players was to accommodate each and everyone's individual needs. No one size fits all. However, back then, national team coaches had even less time on the training field than they do nowadays. Thus, Meisel saw his biggest responsibility in what we call today man management. Only if a coach dedicates himself to every single player will he win his trust. The responsibilities of a coach are thus much bigger off the field than on it. His biggest responsibilities lay in him having his players' trust, making them feel as if they were appreciated for just being who they are. to be a good coach, you had to be a wise friend to them and a guide on their path throughout their career and their life. Meisel actually began his relationships with footballers before they ever debuted for the national team. Another big question was that of tactics. I don't want to bore any of you, but here's the gist of it. At around 1930, there began to be a tactical shift towards the WM system's interpretation favored by Herbert Chapman. Focus was set around defensive stability, an attack that was quick, direct, and physical. Jimmy Hogan was a massive opponent of the system, as he considered it to be more destructive than constructive. Meisel considered it a necessity to adapt to changing circumstances, but he did so not by abandoning the Viennese school. So Meisel didn't play this 3-4-3, he stayed with the traditional 2-3-5 formation. His center half, as it was called back then, was probably the most central piece in his formation. Mainly he was supposed to create and distribute the ball, but he also had defensive responsibilities, including even marking the opponent's central striker sometimes. The players in the half spaces often dropped back and then, when the ball progressed into dangerous areas, burst into open space. They also changed positions with the striker frequently. The striker is also interesting, because this man would often drop back and create instead of just standing in place and trying to score. Obviously, to do all of this, you need to seamlessly understand where your teammates will be at any point and have tremendous on-field intelligence. When do you drop back? When do you move where? When do you pass here? When will my teammate do this? The Austrians seem to have no issue whatsoever understanding these questions. Austria's team was apparently also told to relentlessly pursue their opponents and to win the ball back whenever possible. These tactics were all mostly employed because Meisel thought that they would win him games. He admired the new WM system and Herbert Chapman, but he didn't think that this suited his players, and what doesn't suit your players doesn't work, and what doesn't work doesn't win. And win Austria did. Not really. After a disappointing draw against Hungary, the press was tearing Meisel to pieces. Nobody thought that with such a performance they would stand any chance against the mighty Scottish, who were considered to be amongst the elite national teams at the time. Criticism was pouring in from all sides, and eventually Meisel had enough. In a fashion as dramatic as was typical for him, he went to the ring cafe, smashed his selected 11 for the team on the table, and screamed, "Da habt's euer Schmieranski team!" leaving instantly after that. The Schmieranskis, as Hugo liked to call journalists, looked at this 11 with a bit of optimism. The same couldn't be said of the 40,000 people who attended the game and expected nothing other than a smacking. Austria won 5-0. The press was mesmerized. The viewers were stunned. Vienna was in uproar. Who were the 11 men that had just dethroned the Scottish? In goal played Rudolf Fieden, an incredible shot stopper and one of the best of his day. In defense, it was Schramseis, who was always ready to charge headfirst into any opponent's challenge for his team's success, even when it came at his own expense. To his left, he had veteran captain Josef Blum. Meisel first selected him in 1920, and he was a reliable part of the defense ever since. He gave the team some much-needed leadership. As runners, you had Karl Gall on the left and Georg Braun on the right. Gall was mostly known for his great dribbling ability, whilst Braun was the definition of a disciplined, technically strong player with lungs of steel. At the heart of the game played Smistik. He truly united all characteristics that were necessary to fulfill Meisel's expectations. A master technician that could cause threats both with his passing and shooting from any and all situations. But what differentiated him from others was the fact that he would always give 100% to fulfill his defensive responsibilities. The selections so far were all fairly expected. The defense and midfield personnel were of course gravely important to Austria's success. Yet, even when certain members were replaced, the team retained its ability to comfortably dominate its opponents. The same could not be said about its front five. On the right wing played Karl Zischek, a quick dribbler who was always ready to cause havoc in the opposition defense. On the left wing it was Adolf Vogel. At only 21 years old, he was already a set-piece specialist and an extremely dangerous crosser of the ball. As the right verbinder you had Friedrich Schweidl, a very intelligent player whose greatest quality was exploiting any space that was offered to him by opponents. His height was an additional asset that he knew how to use. To his left, he had Anton Schall, the most pure goal scorer in the entire Wunderteam, and he also opened the scoring against the Scottish. Leading as the sole striker was the legendary Matthias Schindler, a phenomenon on the ball, unbelievably intelligent, precise, a danger wherever he was to be found. He would often drop back out of the striking position and feed both Schall and Schweidel with perfect passes, a revolutionary player, and the best of his time. These five built the heart and soul of the team. When they weren't together, it was far from its best. The attack became sloppy, unfocused, and it always seemed like one element or another was lacking. But when united, nobody could compete. But back then, they were still under scrutiny. After all, one game against the Scottish B team wasn't proof of anything. Germany would need to be the true test. The last game between the former allies happened all the way back in 1924, and Germany won 4-3. Any of the 50,000 Berliners who had thought that this might be repeated were in for a shock. Austria demolished Germany in a 6-0 demonstration of power. The attack and especially goalkeeper Heden played phenomenally well. The next day, the Berlin press would for the first time ever write a word that would become synonymous with this era of Austrian football. Das Wunderteam. After a routine 2-0 victory against Switzerland, the Germans came to get their revenge. Otto Nerz prepared his 11 specifically for this game, but once again Germany stood no chance. A 5-0 thrashing in front of Vienna's cheering masses, Schindler alone scored 3. Something unprecedented seemed to be happening in Vienna. Yes, many nations had seen successful football, a string of good results, even dismantlings of opponents, but what distinguished this team from all others was its style. The football they played was just so beautiful. It was the Viennese school at its peak, in even better. After the Scotland game, the team had already been showered with praise from abroad. Even the almighty English couldn't restrain themselves. This is where the Wunderteam started to unite a nation. As the Great Depression took effect, the terrible political situation of the 1920s became even worse. The feeling of dissatisfaction and that little Austria could not survive always seemed to remain. And in this environment, the Wunderteam suddenly exploded onto the scene. Finally, the people of Vienna's coffee houses boasted, at last, there is something that we can be proud of. You might think that this sounds a bit dramatic, but it's the truth. As Vienna was the city of music, somebody even composed a Wunderteam Marsch. That is hopefully the background music that you're hearing right now. Attendances, despite the lack of money, were enormous. Whoever couldn't watch would listen over radio. This is certainly an element that cannot be neglected when it comes to the Wunderteam's rise. Willi Schmieger was the voice that brought the games to the masses with his live transmissions. Here is a little bit of his commentary over the Wunderteam's 8-2 victory against Hungary in 1932.
Wir stehen 6:2 und es fällt mir gar nicht ein, einen Sieg der österreichischen Mannschaft vorherzusagen, sonst habe ich sofort wieder die österreichische Mannschaft verknobelt. Inzwischen gehen die Ungarn vor. Oh nein, ihr Lieben, ihr werdet ja nichts aufstecken in die österreichische Läuferei. Besonders Nausch ist unermüdlich hinter dem Ball, er hat ihn geschnappt. Ein kleiner Zusammenstoß zwischen Licker und Schall. Schall küsste den Boden, stand aber wieder auf, dehnte die Liebesszene nicht allzu lang aus. Es ist ihm auch gar nichts passiert und der ungarische Läufer Licker hat den Ball über die österreichische Torlinie gestoßen. Wir haben hier einen Outabstoß vom österreichischen Tor zu verzeichnen, also ein sogenanntes gefahrloses Moment. Wir können jetzt ein bisschen abreagieren, wir können uns jetzt freuen über den bisher erreichten Stand und können weiter.
Meisel 2 was so popular, I am personally not sure if he wouldn't have won an election had he run at this time. But politics were not on his mind. What really mattered was the next few games, for maybe the Wunderteam would be able to win the second rendition of the European Cup. Its first game was against the Hungarians, who were extremely annoyed about this Wunderteam talk coming from their neighbors. To put Austria back into its place, the Budapest crowd was ready for war. The Hungarians tried to stop Austria in its tracks. Schall and Heden had to be taken off prematurely because of injury. Additionally, the pitch was in a dire state and not suitable for Viennese football. The game ended 2-2, Austria equalized in the last minutes. Afterwards, the referee had to be escorted out by police and apparently even fainted because he was so scared of the crowd. This affair nearly broke down sporting relations between the countries, but Meisel calmed everyone down. 6 weeks later, Austria went on to do exactly what they had gotten used to before. Away in Basel, Switzerland, 25,000 viewers got to witness their team open the scoring, only to concede 8 in 54 minutes. After the game, Meisel simply said to his players, "Brav habt ihr's gemacht, you have done well." Then followed the big showdown, Austria against Italy. With the Italians 2 points ahead, this was gonna be a title decider. Meisel had to change his team massively. The selection of Walter Nausch in midfield was viewed with particular skepticism. The hardest blow was that Schall, one of the attackers, was completely out of form and had to be replaced. 63,000 went to the Wiener Prater Stadium to watch the game, and after a 0-0 at halftime, Austria had an uphill battle to fight. A draw would probably not be enough for the title. Somebody needed to step up, and Matthias Schindler was the one to do so. Putting the Austrians up 1-0, only 2 minutes later, he received the ball at the halfway line, proceeded to dribble past any and all Italian opposition, only to hammer the ball into the bottom right corner, leaving no chance for goalkeeper Sclavi. Vienna had just witnessed footballing excellence. Italy did go on to score, but it wasn't enough. With a 2-1 victory, Austria only had 2 games to go until the title would be theirs. The next game was a slight bump in the road as they went up against Czechoslovakia. Under dreadful conditions with puddles up to 20 centimeters deep, both teams were able to swim themselves to a 1-1 draw. Meanwhile, Italy had also only drawn away to Hungary. If Austria won their game against Switzerland, they would be the champions of Europe. And so, in front of 55,000 people, the Wunderteam could not show its usual prowess, with multiple of its best players completely out of form. Still, a 3-1 was enough to secure the title, and newspapers across the country displayed the headline, "Österreich ist Europameister." Although not always as glorious as one might imagine from its nickname, it should be mentioned that the Wunderteam played 14, won 12 and drew 2, scoring 55 and conceding 14. Some might argue Austria only won those games convincingly that weren't important. However, this argument only works in hindsight, because back then, friendlies were much more important than they are nowadays. Big tournaments were a novelty. The audience interest was still in any and all national games, which were viewed as representing national honor. Also to be considered is that the attack was not always complete, and a point that Meisel raised after the win against Switzerland. With 8 men out of form, you cannot expect a good team performance. For some newspapers, however, these were all foul excuses. Performances needed to improve. And you might ask yourself, why they would even do this after they just won a title? That is because to many, the title was one thing, but the real prize lay across the English Channel. Austrian football had been connected with the English from its inception. The admiration for England as the fathers of the sport was always present. Any English player in Austria was practically carried like the kings of old. A glimpse of its own national team on the British Isles was for the longest time a mere fantasy. But with the ascendance of the Wunderteam, everything was turned on its head. England was fascinated with the success of this tiny Central European nation, and even more so by its style of play. When used to kick and rush, the Viennese style must have been a fascinating sight to behold. Thus, a game was arranged for December 7th, 1932, at Stamford Bridge. Meisel was excited as a child about this. His admiration for the English overshadowed that of all others in Austria. He fancied the English style of play, and their robustness and speed were something that he always thought his players lacked. His opinion was probably not dampened by the fact that 2 of his best friends in football, Herbert Chapman and Jimmy Hogan, were Englishmen. Speaking of these 2, they played an important role during this trip. Chapman had been writing back and forth with Meisel for months and got the idea to involve Hogan as the head coach of Austria during the trip. Although he had recently joined Paris Racing and Football Club, he specifically had a clause in his contract that he could set himself free for any time the Austrian national team called. Thus, the old duo was united once more, for probably the most important game of both of their careers. As preparation, Hogan mostly focused on teaching the team about the English style of play. Schindler's observations may have reflected that of his teammates when he said that the English game is like a boxing match, whilst in Vienna football had remained a game of chess. They knew that they couldn't compete physically, but technically they were the superior side. Their confidence was high. Meanwhile, Meisel was deadly nervous. To Herbert Chapman he wrote before the game, "I fear that from the sporting point of view we shall not be able to fulfill the expectations." The pressure on his shoulders was massive. Every Austrian that could would watch this game. The game was transmitted live through speakers at the Wiener Heldenplatz, shops were closed and parliamentary sessions halted, all for a 90-minute period. It wasn't just that Austrian media outlets were talking about a battle between systems, and remember, the Viennese school represented the city's honor. Media outlets from across Europe were talking about how the Austrians needed to represent the continent as the English remained unbeaten on home soil. On a purely intellectual level, Meisel knew that his team stood a chance. He had already written about how they had surpassed the English tactically, but all the problems they were facing, poor form, not enough preparation, pressure from the media and populace, injuries to both Schweidl and Vogel, and maybe most important of all was that this was Meisel's life work. Since the early 1900s, he had sacrificed everything for the sport. He had shaped European football in his image and formed one of the best national teams of all time. At this point in time, he was 51 years old. He had gone through a major health crisis. He consumed cigarettes and coffee all day. He just sat at his desk working through file after file. He had this one opportunity to do himself justice. At 14:15 p.m., England against Austria, the game of the century kicked off in front of an audience of 60,000. It began with a nervous Wunderteam and an England that came bashing forwards. After only 5 minutes, goalkeeper Heaton made an error that led to a corner, handing England the lead. The Austrians continued to stagger and had great problems with the winter, which did not suit their style. After 27 minutes, the English scored their second. At half-time, it looked bleak. But Meisel had an ace up his sleeve. I haven't talked about this yet, but this man's half-time talks were legendary.
Nun ist dann der Meisel gekommen, nicht? Haben alle geschaut, die haben gewusst, jetzt kommt er, nicht? Und da ist er reingekommen, ist wieder der General, nicht? Und er hat gesagt, also, meine Herren, so da ungefähr, gell? Ihr wisst, um was geht. Kampf, 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 sagt er. Und weh, wenn mir einer stehen bleibt und rennt nicht. So hat er gesprochen, was er gesagt.
Austria came out all guns blazing, immediately pressing the English back into their half as they displayed what they were capable of. Zizek only scored 6 minutes after the game had resumed. The Austrians kept on pressing forward, but Schweidl missed multiple good chances, including hitting the post. In minute 77, a free kick deflected off the wall and into the back of the net. It was now 3-1, but the Austrians did not give up, and after a wonderful pass by Vogel, Schindler brought them back into the game, followed by another English response to make it 4-2. But still, this was not a game that could be given up. Austria was the only side playing football now, and when Zizek scored in minute 87 to make it 4-3, it looked like there remained a chance, and in the last seconds of the game, Vogel found himself in space, only to take a shot and miss.
Oh, schön, das hat der Vogel hat traut sich nicht mit dem linken Fuß. Wie den linken Fuß hinten hab, und will er das lange Eck über haben. Hat er den Ball mit dem rechten weg und dann komme ich zu spät mit links.
The game of the century, as it was called back then, ended 4-3 for the home side in an Austrian victory. Even though they had lost the game, they did their city justice. A lot of people agreed that, had they not started the game shivering, they would have come out victorious. Jimmy Hogan's analysis was similar. He concluded that England would get outpaced by the continent eventually. Time would prove him right. Journalists and the media praised the team into oblivion, and even at home, both Vienna's press and its people only found good things to be said about their boys. Meisel said about the result that he is content with it, and that it was a good performance. He must have been relieved. Back home, he received all the love in the world. The media, The government, FIFA, everyone praised and loved him. He was even congratulated by his admired friend, Sir Chapman. Meisel truly was at the peak of his popularity. But after peaks comes downturns. Already on the way home from London, Meisel was skeptical. Now we have reached the peak of popular opinion. I'm eager to see how many will be with us once the wagon rolls backwards. Such melancholic remarks must have seemed strange. Austria had just played convincingly against the English and on its way back pummeled the French and then the Belgians. Additionally, another Austrian team had won the Mitropa Cup, and this time it was even Meisel's favorite club, Austria Wien. You would expect this to just be momentary pessimism, and maybe it was, but these remarks hit the nail on the head, as Austria's hard-earned fame came crashing down in 90 minutes against Czechoslovakia. The game ended 1-2 for the away side, and Austria's record was gone with it. Whoever thought that this must have just been a bit of misfortune or a selection issue and that everything was going to be okay once the famed front five returned was in for a heavy treat. Heeden left Austria to join Hogan at Paris Racing and Football Club. Defender Blum ended his career. Schweidel wouldn't really feature anymore. Vogel was already massively injured when he played in England and couldn't be selected again. Meisel had to see the Wunderteam fall apart in lightning speed. And at the same time went Austria's political stability. The nation got embroiled in political controversy yet again. Newfound dictator Engelbert Dollfuss wanted to use football as a marketing tool and was even present during the defeat to Czechoslovakia to make photos with all associates of the popular national team, much to the dismay of the Viennese audience, who booed him into the ground. As Austria struggled through the year of 1933, the Social Democrats would grow increasingly sick of their ruler. A 4-day-long civil war broke out. By the end of it, Austrian democracy had once and for all been disbanded and replaced by a fascist dictatorship. Meanwhile, Meisel sought to build a strong lineup for the 1934 World Cup by employing his old methods of chopping and changing. At first, this seemed to work. A good string of results at the start of 1934 led to people speculating about a Wunderteam number 2 that was not defined by its elegance and Viennese football, but rather by its toughness, power, speed, and clinical finishing. Unfortunately, this was a fluke. At the World Cup, Austria had a hard time dispatching of France and struggled against Hungary before facing Italy in what was one of the most rigged games in World Cup history. The press handled the obvious Italian corruption diplomatically and chose to blame Hugo Meisel instead. One outlet even questioned how he thinks to get back to his apartment unharmed. This culmination of events seemed to have been the straw that broke the camel's back. Meisel offered his resignation, but they wouldn't let him. They wanted his head, but they also wanted him to go on. And he did, but the optimism that he had previously displayed was seemingly gone. Viennese football was bleeding dry, and it was noticeable. Only 2 Austrian teams reached the Mitropa Cup final after 1933, and only Austria Wien was able to win it. The national team also became worse and worse. However, Meisel did get a last win for himself when Austria faced England on the 6th of May, 1936. By this point, he had gone back to playing Schindler at number 9. Once again, his old star man would not disappoint. In minute 12, he set up Viertel perfectly, and then again it was Schindler who would assist Geiter, making it 2-0 after only 17 minutes. Meisel was ecstatic. As England scored in minute 54, he started lying down in the grass behind the goal. It was as if he wanted to keep the English away with his stern look. When Austria was on the counterattack, he got up and sprinted down the wing as if he was a supporting attacker, like back in the old days. When the ref blew the final whistle, it was official. Meisel had beaten England. At last, after 30 years in football, and by the end of his journey, when his team was no longer what it had been, when he was no longer what he had been, when he revolutionized the sport, Hugo Meisel had proven that he still got it. And it did not need a Wunderteam for him to do so. He was immensely happy about his last big triumph. On the 17th of February, 1937, at around 11:30 a.m., Richard Fischer, player for First Vienna, was set to meet Hugo Meisel. After a bit of small talk, Meisel said that he just needs to sit down because he isn't feeling well, and then his head hits the table. Just minutes later, it was already confirmed. Hugo Meisel, the greatest football thinker of his time, had passed away. In retrospect, it comes as no real surprise. After all, he had consumed copious amounts of cigarettes, copious amounts of coffee, and he worked, and he worked, and he died working. Newspapers worldwide reported about Meisel's death. Sadness was felt wherever people enjoyed the beautiful game. Particularly struck was the city of Vienna. Although Meisel's testament stated that he wished to be buried only in the presence of those closest to him, his city needed to say its goodbyes to its football general. Mourned by over 700 attendees, Hugo Meisel was carried to his final destination. Over the next year, his grave would be showered with love, decorated extensively by funeral wreaths from personalities, newspapers, football associations, from Jimmy Hogan to FIFA itself. Most foreign national teams would not miss the opportunity to visit the grave of this great man who had given his life for football. This veneration of Hugo Meisel was, however, short-lived.
Als Führer und Kanzler der deutschen Nation und des Reichs melde ich vor der deutschen Geschichte nunmehr den Eintritt meiner Heimat in das Deutsche Reich.
On the 12th of March 1938, Germany marched into Austria. Celebrated by thousands, they declared that the country was no more. And what happened to Austrian football? Well, in the following months, the ÖFB was cleansed of Jewish elements. Or in other words, Jews in the ÖFB, banned. Clubs with Jewish identities, banned. Football professionalism, swept away. The Viennese school, replaced by a militaristic interpretation of the sport. Coffee houses, the home of the intellectual class of Jewry. Obviously, their influence had to go. To symbolize the national unity of the German peoples, the Anschluss game between a German and an Austrian 11 was hosted in the Wiener Praterstadion. Herein, Schindler displayed his last world-class performance at the ripe old age of 35. The Viennese school got its last moments of glory as Germany was beaten 2-0, with both goals being scored by Wunderteam players. Afterwards, all 22 players signed a card stating that they will vote for the Anschluss and for the Führer. 1 week later, 99.75% of their countrymen did exactly that. Austria was now just a part of the Reich, the ÖFB just a part of the DFB, and the Wunderteam a glorified, propagandized memory, just like its members. That is true for all, except the man who had built it. With Nazism in power, Meisel was no longer remembered as the finest of his generation. No, he was not remembered at all. His name was erased from history. This is best shown by a Nazi propaganda piece from 1941. Therein the word was spread about the Wunderteam, the glories of Schindler and others, but the man who stood on top of it all was simply ignored. This is the reason why I wanted to create this video, around Hugo Meisel. After realizing how anti-Semitism, how institutional racism destroyed the legacy of one of sport's revolutionaries, I knew that he deserved to be the focal point. But that is not the only reason. It is also because many of the Wunderteam were profiteers of Nazism. To show this to you, I will provide you with the following graphic. Are you ready? A mixed picture, isn't it? Almost all of the Wunderteam's players had active careers in football under Nazi rule. At least 2 were drafted to fight in the East, 2 were members of the Nazi party. Johann Mock was even a member of the, at the time illegal, Sturmabteilung. You also had others, like Karl Sester, who helped in organizing the Anschluss referendum. Both Sester and the aforementioned Rainer also owned Aryanized property. Aryanized meaning stolen from Austrian Jews and then sold to Germans. But you also had others. Take the case of Walter Nausch. When the Anschluss came, he refused to divorce his Jewish wife and denounced Nazism. In November 1938, he fled to Switzerland to avoid Nazi persecution. Rudolf Hieden actively fought in the French army and was a prisoner of war. The only one that is left out here is Matthias Schindler. His name is wrapped up in so many mysteries that it would be just absurd to start debunking them all right now. But let me put it like this. Schindler was not a fanatical anti-Nazi. Schindler was also not a Nazi. Yes, he celebrated extensively after he scored the 1-0 in the Anschluss game. Yes, he refused to play for Germany. Yes, he was supportive of some Jews, such as disposed Austrian president Michael Schwarz. On the other hand, he owned an Aryanized cafe and was friends with said fanatical Nazi Johann Mock. Schindler offers us a contradictory picture of a man that was not a Nazi, probably a moderate, and just about content with how things were. But most important when it comes to him is his death. On the 24th of January 1939, Schindler was suddenly and unexpectedly found dead in the apartment of his girlfriend Camilla Castagnola, who suffered the same fate. The death was very mysterious and left many questions unanswered. The theories are endless and range from a political murder to an intentional suicide, but the evidence suggests that it was neither. Most likely, he and his girlfriend were the victims of an accident. But why, you might ask, did people make up this fantastical story of a footballer and resistance hero murdered by the Nazis? Essentially, if you believed the myths about Schindler, you are the victim of the victim myth. This post-war Austrian propaganda was created to make you believe that Austria wasn't an active and willing participant of Nazi war crimes. The Wunderteam was a wonderful pawn in this game of historical revisionism. You have an, at the time, well-known international sensation that brings about a first uproar of patriotism, culminating in a close loss, and the starman of the team dies in a mysterious way after the country had ceased to exist? A story for national origins basically wrote itself here. Just rewrite this iconic striker into an anti-Nazi figure, a patriot amongst patriots, and tada, you've got your martyr figure. Essentially, Schindler's story was just another example of football getting used by politics. We have seen it time and time again today, be it by Mussolini, by Dollfuss, or by Hitler. This isn't supposed to say, of course, that politics need to be kept out of football. No, football needs to strictly associate itself with the correct politics. Because if you just take the status quo and accept it as it is, which is just what Hugo Meisel did, then you are sending an open invitation for somebody to come in and use you for their gain. This is of course also not to say that Hugo Meisel bears the blame for anything that happened here. No, of course not. Meisel was not the Wunderteam, and he certainly couldn't direct in what political direction Austria or Europe would head in. He is a central piece in his own little world, but even there he is not the one, because there is never a story wherein one man conquers the world, even if it is oh so tiny as the world of football is. Meisel was influenced and got help from people all over the place. Even though I framed this video around him, it still holds true that Meisel was a part of a larger story. I don't want anybody to walk away with the impression that he achieved the faint success of Austria all on his own. So if none of this is the moral of the story, what sticks when we ask today, what was the Wunderteam? Really, the Wunderteam is symptomatic for the Vienna of the interwar period. Not only that all parts of society were represented in it, from rich to poor, and later also from fanatic to a supporter, a bystander, a resistor, and a victim. It also represents the contradictions within a community that found itself in a crisis of identity. Was Vienna a world capital? Or was it poor? Was Vienna a city of culture? Or was it German? These things contradicted each other. The Wunderteam, just for a bit of time, brought together a great many people, because everyone could feel a connection to it. But in the end, Vienna chose to rid itself of the culture, the intellectualism, the coffee houses, and its Jews in favor of destruction.